morning, everyone. First of all, thank you very much to Micah and Andrew for being friends to Aaron and friends to me. It's a great privilege to be here this morning. And Aaron would either be deeply embarrassed to have been the inspiration for this year's theme or deeply upset that he was missing it, and I'm frankly not sure which. Today I'm going to talk about a topic that Aaron and I obsessed over. That is, as a campaigner, how can you know whether you're changing the world? Now, it's actually a component of a larger question, which is, as a campaigner, how can you actually change the world? But if you're setting out to have a lifetime of impact, it's important to put in place structures that allow you to know whether what you're doing at least could be making a difference. And that brings me to the title of my talk. You know nothing, campaigners. The Game of Thrones fans in the audience will know what I'm talking about. I don't want to spoil the show for anyone, but for those of you who are in the know, it's a term of endearment. I love campaigners. Aaron was a campaigner. I'm a campaigner. So what do I mean when I say, you know nothing, campaigners? Well, first, let me define what I mean by campaigner. And I forgot to get the clicky thing. Campaigners are different from organizers. The fundamental mission of an organizer is to empower other people to create change. The fundamental mission of a campaigner, though, is to set their sights on a particular change they want to create in the world, and then go out and make it happen, whatever it takes. If that happens to involve empowering people along the way, then that's great. But if you can make that change by having drinks with the nephew of a senator, so be it. Most of the people here are campaigners, at least as one of your hats. Even if you're really not, you're probably at least making decisions about what campaigners or campaigning organizations to support with your money, time, and other resources. And for the next 10 minutes, I'd like you to do something very uncomfortable. I'd like you to drop all of your presuppositions that you might be having impact, or the organizations that you're working with might be having impact. I'd like you to cold-bloodedly examine the evidence that you have for that impact. And I'd like you to think about how you could tighten the feedback loop between what you think you're accomplishing and what you're actually accomplishing. Let me tell you why I'm starting from a place of skepticism. In the instances that I know of where there's been a serious attempt to measure the impact of do-gooderism, it's become fairly clear that a lot of the work that's being done is either very inefficient or totally wasted. So in the case of development aid, a group called GiveWell has been working for years to measure the impact of development aid NGOs. GiveWell was founded by a close friend of Aaron's. And it's been looking for measurable improvement in the health and wealth of people in developing countries based on the actions of these NGOs. And last year, it could only find one nonprofit in the entire world that had compelling evidence that giving money to it would be better than giving money directly to poor people in developing countries. Now, I'm not alleging fraud, and I'm not saying you shouldn't donate to charity. In fact, I think giving money directly to poor people in developing countries is a great idea. But what I am saying is that there are literally thousands of these NGOs in the world, and they're premised on the notion that giving them money is an efficient way to improve the lives of people in developing countries, and yet only one of them actually has convincing evidence that that's the case. Another example is election turnout and persuasion. The Analyst Institute and the AFL-CIO have spent years learning how to effectively persuade voters to change what candidate they support and then to turn out to the polls. And one of the things they've seen is that the vast majority of the voters that political consultants will tell you are persuadable actually don't move when you spend money trying to convince them to change their candidate support. And in fact, sometimes when you spend that money, it actually backfires and they change their support in the wrong direction. Moreover, there's essentially no solid research whatsoever. The television ads have serious impacts on elections. And what evidence there is suggests that any impact they do have isn't sticky until the last week of the election campaign, and yet we spend literally billions of dollars on these tactics. So, okay, to begin with, we've got a bad track record of do-gooders who think they're doing good, but don't have any evidence to back it up, and often are, in fact, proved wrong when we examine the evidence. The other reason to be skeptical is that human beings have deep cognitive biases that make it hard to assess the value of the work that we're doing. Aaron wrote a blog post last year that was entitled "Confront Reality." He started it off with a quote from George Orwell. "We're all capable of believing things which we know to be untrue, And then when we're finally proved wrong, impudently twisting the facts so as to show that we were right. Intellectually, it's possible to carry on this process for an indefinite time. The only check on it is that sooner or later, a false belief bumps up against solid reality, often on a battlefield. Orwell was right. One of the projects of modern psychology has been to show many biases in human psychology. And at play here are things like the confirmation bias, the optimism bias, and the bandwagon effect. When everyone in your organization, including yourself, has a deep vested interest in believing that you're creating positive change in the world, by far the path of least resistance is to believe that, evidence or lack thereof be damned. When you ask a campaigning organization to demonstrate the impact they're having, here are some of the kinds of answers you might have heard. It's the most important issue of our generation. We had meetings with the decision makers over and over again. We mobilized lots of people. We made thousands of phone calls. Public opinion's shifting in our direction. Look at all those media hits we got. And look, we won. The change we were trying to create in the world actually happened. So which of these indicators do you think actually are causally indicative of an effective campaign? The answer is none. These are what we sometimes call vanity metrics. You could have all of these things simultaneously be true and yet have your work have no impact. Take healthcare, for instance. I suspect there are dozens of organizations that could have said all of these things around the Affordable Care Act. But which of them, if they hadn't been doing their campaigns, would the Affordable Care Act actually not have passed? I have no idea, and I suspect no one does. Now, the truth is that measuring the impact of campaigning is very difficult. But what I'm here today to argue is that it's not impossible and that we ought to be spending far more resources trying to do it than we currently do. We ought to be trying to bump up against reality. So I'm going to outline two strategies for how you do that as campaigners. The first is the science strategy. Stand back. I'm going to try science. This strategy has become much more possible because of new technology and the internet, and it's one of the things that fascinated Aaron about the online campaigning world and one of the reasons he moved into it. The organizations like Change.org and MoveOn, the sort of new wave of online campaigning organizations, have the capacity to run lots of small, similar campaigns, and then to test different tactics and see which ones are working. The example I'm going to use is from a former Change.org staffer, Jess Kutch, who I think is somewhere in the audience here. Jess is currently working at a brand new and very interesting startup called coworker.org. If you haven't checked it out, you should. But back when she was at Change, she was running an anti-foreclosure project. Dozens of homeowners around the country started petitions on change.org trying to get banks not to foreclose on their houses. And Jess saw an opportunity. She saw different homeowners using different tactics, and in fact, she guided them to use different tactics from each other. For instance, some of them would ask for a single point of contact from the bank. And then she could watch and see which of those sets of tactics tended to lead to success. By testing tactics at scale, she was able to bump up against the reality of dealing with banks and learn how to do it better. Aaron and I talked about taking the science strategy even further. He was fascinated by the idea of controlled experiments on state legislators. An online campaigning group could easily generate dozens of phone calls to half of the state legislators in a state and none to the other half, and then see if it affected how they voted on a bill. Given the amount of resources we put into making phone calls to politicians, it seems perfectly reasonable to try and ascertain whether that makes any sense at all. And yet I've basically never seen any tests like this ever run. Who cares if you can get more people to make phone calls by picking the best subject line in an email if you don't even know if the phone calls have an impact? The failure to implement the science strategy in a rigorous way is one of the biggest missed opportunities thus far in the online campaigning space. Now, we don't all have access to the science strategy because it requires scale. But we all have access to the second method I'm going to outline, the Goldilocks strategy. In his blog post, Confront Reality, Aaron wrote, "Being great isn't as easy as just picking a hard goal. In fact, picking a really hard goal avoids reality almost as much as picking a really easy one. If you pick an easy goal, you know you'll always succeed because it's so easy. If you pick a really hard one, you know you'll never fail because it will always be too early to tell." He continued, "The trick is to set yourself lots of small challenges along the way. If your startup is eventually going to make $1 million, can you start by making 10? If your book is going to persuade everyone in the world, can you start by persuading your friends? Instead of pushing all your tests for success way off into the indefinite future, see if you can pass a very small test right now. In the context of campaigning, what Aaron meant was this: don't start by tackling the biggest legislative fight of the year, the one everyone else is working on. Instead, look for something wrong with the world that no one else is working on, something that it's clear won't be fixed if you don't work on it, something important, but not so important that it's impossible. And then you see if you can win it. If you can get the Senate to change one sentence in a bill that increases protections for car owners, then great, you know that you have some tactics that can actually change the behavior of senators. If you can't do that, it's really unlikely you're going to have an impact on something as big as healthcare reform. The organization I run, some of us, is already implementing these strategies. I've set a goal for my campaigns team to win at least 8 campaigns this year where we're pretty sure where we have good reason to believe that the campaign would not have been won without us. The requirement to both win the campaign and have a compelling reason to believe it wouldn't have been won without us is the Goldilocks strategy. We have to pick campaigns that are not too big but not too small. And the target of 8 is large enough that as long as we vary our tactics from campaign to campaign, we should be able to begin to see patterns about what's working and what's not. That's the science strategy. And as we learn more about how to change corporate behavior, we'll be able to ratchet up the difficulty of our campaigns. The last paragraph of Aaron's blog post reads, "Go out and test yourself today. Pick a task just hard enough that you might fail, and try to succeed at it. Reality is painful, but it's impossible to get better without confronting it." So let me close with 2 final hard questions for 2 different audiences in this room about how you're confronting reality. First, if you're a funder, ask yourself this: what do you accept as evidence of impact from those you're funding? Are they making assumptions about key steps, like the impact of phone calls, that could be verified or falsified empirically? If so, are they interested in testing those assumptions, and are you helping them find the resources to do so? And I should interject here, or else risk the wrath of my board treasurer, that if you want to support some of us in our quest to learn how to have impact, we are fundraising right now. But also, back to the funders, perhaps even more importantly, are you finding and investing in social entrepreneurs who have the mindset to confront reality? These people are few and far between, and they're invaluable. And in some ways, they're hard to fund because they're much more likely to admit failure than someone who's emotionally invested in believing that they're succeeding. But it's much worse to fail in actual fact and continue to claim success and eat up resources than it is to fail, admit it, and move on. Those are the kinds of people you should be funding. And finally, if you're a campaigner, are you questioning all your assumptions? Are you mistaking vanity metrics for impact? Are you taking every opportunity you have to bump up against reality, to implement the science strategy and the Goldilocks strategy? Are you at an organization that values that kind of questioning, even at the cost of admitting that you might not have been effective in the past? No one else will do that intellectual work for you. You know nothing, campaigners, but you can.